This episode of Legacy Battle is sponsored by W Energy Drink.
W Energy is a more affordable and healthy sports drink option with over 10 plus flavors, no artificial fillers or dyes, made to prevent crashes, jitters, and angst.
Go to www.wdubby.gg and order your sports drink today. Put in the promo code Legacy Battle for a 10% discount. Thank you for watching. Welcome back to another episode of Legacy Battle. I am Michael Adams. My panelists tonight from the Gridiron Battle Zone, Brian King from Steelers Nation South, Rollo Coffin. And we got a new panelist tonight, Matt Cowardy from Max Sports. Check out his podcast and all his information. You can find it on Facebook. I'm sure it's a couple other places. You can throw that down when he starts talking. We have a debate tonight of the greatest NFL Dynasty pre-2000s. So sorry, Chiefs and Patriots fans. And we are joined by Russell Baxter, who has been writing about football for over 40 years. Spent more than 2 decades with ESPN. He was responsible for a team that won a bunch of Emmys. And he is currently with On SI, Fansided, and Spin Zone. So welcome, Russell. Thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, this should be a lot of fun. This is right in my wheelhouse, history.
Hey,
looking forward to this.
Yeah, you check out all this stuff. You're going to see a lot of football when you Google this guy. So we'll have a Q&A after for him, talk about his career a little bit as well. But we are going to start tonight with Brian and the 1960s Packers.
All right, so the story of the 1960s Green Bay Packers, it really starts with the hiring of head coach Vince Lombardi in 1959. He took over a squad that had gone 1-10-1 the previous season and transformed them into winners very quickly. 7-5 in 59, 8-4 in a postseason berth in 60, and then NFL champions in 61 and 62. Those 2 championships occurred when the AFL was still in its infancy, so no Super Bowls were being played yet. But if they had occurred, the Packers definitely would have been huge favorites. The Pack went 19-7-2 over the next 2 seasons, but just missed the postseason. But then they bounced back and won the NFL championship in 1965, 66, and 67. In 66, they won what became known as Super Bowl I, 35-10 over Kansas City. Then they blew out the Raiders the next year, 33-14 in Super Bowl II. Sadly, Lombardi was diagnosed with cancer and vacated the Packers' job the next year, but the Packers still managed to be an average team, going 14-13-1 to finish out the 60s decade. For the 60s decade, 96 regular season wins, only 37 losses, 5 ties, 5 NFL championships, 2 Super Bowl rings, 3 times they had the number 1 defense, 4 times the number 2 defense, and twice the 3rd ranked defense. Hall of Famers, there was, of course, Lombardi, Jim Taylor, Forrest Gregg, Bart Starr, Ray Nitschke, Herb Adderley, Willie Davis, Jim Ringo, Paul Hornung, Willie Wood, Henry Jordan, Dave Robinson, and Jerry Kramer, 13 in all. The legacy, set by this dynasty was legendary. You had the Lombardi sweep, was unstoppable at times and often imitated. Titletown became the second name for the city of Green Bay. Lombardi was very instrumental in the racial integration of the league. And of course, besides rings, each Super Bowl champion at the end of the year wins the Lombardi trophy. So that's a heck of a legacy set by this dynasty.
Nice job, Brian. And I appreciate that you did the whole decade because, there's always some good with some bad when we're looking at a 10-year period here. And I just want to throw out one stat in your favor because I was disappointed my Cowboys I'll represent later didn't have it, is that they have the highest point differential tonight at plus 1,307, and that is over 150 better than the next team tonight. So kudos to you, Russell. Man, the Lombardi Trophy, it came from this dynasty. So I know it's a long time ago, but give us your thoughts on it, and something that maybe might have stuck out about that dynasty for you.
Well, when you think of Green Bay and Vince Lombardi, you think of fundamentally sound. Okay. It wasn't like they had this expanded playbook. You talked about the Packers sweep. It was so efficient, even when people knew it was coming, they couldn't stop it because it was all based on execution and discipline. And, you think about what he did, Vince Lombardi, who never had a losing season. Even the year after he left Green Bay, he went to Washington and they had a winning record. Okay. He only lost one postseason game as a head coach, and that was in 1960 to the Eagles. And again, you look at playoff record Lombardi compared to other. Well, he doesn't have as many as Belichick. He doesn't. Well, there weren't as many playoff games back then. Okay, so it was a different playoff format. We didn't really get into expanded playoffs in the NFL until 1978. You'll recall, even after the merger from 1970 to 77, there were only 4 playoff teams in each conference, 3 division champions and a wild card. And it was very screwy up until 1990. You couldn't play a team in your own division in the playoffs until the conference title game. And that changed all in 1990. So you have to keep that stuff in mind. Jerry Kramer waited a long time to get in the Hall of Fame, but I think there's no question about what he did. Their defense were so fundamentally sound. You think about Max McGee in Super Bowl I, who wasn't really supposed to start, and obviously felt very good during the game or the night before the game and so on. And, he could have made a case he would have been MVP. I mean, Bart Starr was not a high round draft choice as a quarterback, but he was such a leader. You really can't look at the stats of the 60s and the early 70s and compare them to today because the rules were dramatically different. But 5 titles speaks a lot. And I'll give you one other factoid that maybe people don't realize. And although it was probably brought aware of last year with Kansas City, the longest winning streak in terms of championships in the history of the National Football League is 3. Okay, it's not like hockey. It's not like the World Series where you can, 5 in a row or 4 in a row. 3. That would be the Packers from 29 to 31. We're not talking about them, I understand. That was pre-playoff. That was pre-postseason. But the Packers from 65 to 67 remain the team that's won 3 in a row. And that's it. Okay, and I know the first one wasn't a Super Bowl, but NFL titles are NFL titles. And that's why the Packers have more NFL titles, 13, than any franchise in the league.
Let's move to the 70s, and that's going to be represented by Matt. And if you can't tell by what he's wearing, then you don't watch a lot of football.
Oh, I thought we were going to talk about Iowa. Oh, okay. Now I got it. All right.
All right. So a lot of people have their own interpretations of when the Steel Curtain dynasty formed and when the Steelers became a powerhouse in the NFL. With me, it goes back to 1969 when the Steelers had hired Chuck Noll as their head coach at the time, and they had a deplorable 1-13 season that year, which still stands as their worst record in franchise history. But that was seen more as a stepping stone as they drafted the very guy whose jersey that I'm wearing right here, Terry Bradshaw, first overall in 1970. And just 2 years later, after a couple of down years in 70 and 71, it was clear that the Steelers may have been on the rise with hitting on draft picks. But then 72 came, the Steelers went 11-3, and they made it to their first ever playoff game up to that point since 1947 when they lost to the Philadelphia Eagles. And they played the Oakland Raiders, led by legendary Hall of Fame head coach John Madden, may he rest in peace. And if, in case you live under a rock, you know what happens in that game with the immaculate reception with Franco.
No,
Harris.
what happened?
Oh, really? I got to explain this?
No.
Bradshaw goes back. Bradshaw rolls in the pocket, flushes right, throws a pass downfield to Frenchie Fakwa, gets deflected, and Franco Harris at his shoestrings makes the catch, runs the remaining 42 yards for the game-winning touchdown with under 10 seconds to go.
Or did he?
Known as the immaculate reception. And from that point on, a lot of people consider that to be the start of the dynasty, as just 2 years later, The Steelers won the Super Bowl 1974 over the Minnesota Vikings. Franco Harris was your Super Bowl MVP with a dominant performance by the Steel Curtain defense. Then in 75, defeated the Dallas Cowboys, who were a previous Super Bowl champion at that time as well, 21-17. Lynn Swann taking home the Super Bowl MVP as well. Then they won 2 more Super Bowls in a row in 78 and 79, again putting 35 on the Dallas Cowboys defense with Terry Bradshaw not only winning regular season MVP, but Super Bowl MVP as well. And then a scrappy 31-19 win over the Los Angeles Rams in a game that was a lot closer than people remember, where Terry Bradshaw again took home the Super Bowl MVP honors. And before he knew it, the Steelers went from doormats to being 4-time Super Bowl champions and the first franchise to ever achieve 4 Super Bowl wins in total. And the reason for this dynasty becoming so dominant was because of very smart and prolific drafting by the front office. Chuck Noll setting the foundation for the Steelers and their identity that carries over into what they have established themselves to be now. And cornerstone and iconic and Hall of Famer and iconic players, Terry Bradshaw, Rocky Bleier, Franco Harris, Lynn Swann, John Stallworth, and of course the Steel Curtain itself, Mean Joe Green, L.C. Greenwood, Ernie Holmes, Dwight White. Then you got Jack Ham, Jack Lambert, Mel Blount, Donnie Shell, Mike Wagner. List goes on and on about all the great individuals from those 70 Steelers teams. But in short, you got Chuck Noll winning off AFC Coach of the Year in 1972. Franco Harris was offensive Rookie of the Year. You got Mean Joe Green winning two Defensive Players of the Year. Jack Lambert took home that honor as well, as long as Defensive Rookie of the Year. Mel Blount taking home a Defensive Player of the Year. Bradshaw, as I mentioned, regular season and 2-time Super Bowl MVP. And the Steelers back then, like I said, from doormats, a nice rags to riches story. And that's why that 70s dynasty is still so cherished and remembered and immortalized today.
Russell, maybe not single season, but overall, is the Steel Curtain the greatest defense of all time? And your thoughts on this dynasty?
Yeah, that's a great question. I always talk about the 2000 Ravens in terms of one season. A lot of people point to the Bears in '85, and I get all that. But this is a stat I often quoted to Chris Berman when we worked together. The Baltimore Ravens in 2000 obviously won the Super Bowl. They gave up 188 points in 20 games. Think about that. 188 points in 20 games, including the postseason. That's mind-boggling in this day and age. And the rules have been tweaked. I get all that stuff. Now, go back to what you were saying as far as the tenure. And a lot of that obviously is helped by the fact that there was no free agency in the 70s. Okay, so if you drafted, you usually hung on to your players. And the Steelers were able to do that for a long time, especially that that defensive line. Ernie Holmes was not around for the last 2 Super Bowls. Dwight White was around for all of them. Lambert and Ham, obviously. Jack Ham obviously did not play in Super Bowl 14. He was injured and so on. But to me, and I know we're going to talk 80s 49ers and we're going to talk 90s Cowboys. We've already talked the 60s Packers. And I think they've kind of close. When you think about the 70s Steelers, the word to me, legendary, comes up. It was a legendary team. This was a franchise that couldn't get out of its way from 1933. You mentioned the 47 game in the playoffs. They were horrendous. They made the Tampa Bay Buccaneers in the 70s and 80s look like a dynasty. That's how bad they were. And then they brought on Chuck Noll. And a guy who just went in the Hall of Fame not too long ago, a scout named Bill Nunn, played a big role in them acquiring talent. And their drafting was absolutely superb. Again, we're going to talk about the other teams, but I'm going to throw out a couple things about the 70 Steelers that were always impressive. First off, in an 8-year span, they only lost 1 game to a team that finished with a losing record by the end of the year. They lost to the Bengals in 79. That's how they were remarkably consistent against the teams they knew had to beat, and then more than held their own against the teams that were as good or maybe at times better than them. Okay. The other thing that stands out with the 70 Steelers is the fact that they won their first 2 Super Bowls playing old school football. In other words, before the rules were changed. Okay. They ran it down your throat. They stifled you on defense. That front 4 enabled them to drop 7 into coverage. And then the rules changed in 1978, as you guys know. They wanted to open up the passing game. You weren't supposed to hit receivers 5 yards downfield. You could extend your arms as a pass blocker, which was different. So the Steelers changed. They became a team that used the pass to set up the run. And they won back-to-back Super Bowls doing that. And I always thought, wow, so you won it the old way and you won it the new way. And that was, by the way, an 8-year span where they were dominant. They also, and I think this is what helped them become such a great team. 2 aspects. First off, the Oakland Raiders were around. And if the Steelers weren't around, goodness knows how many titles the Raiders would have won. You know, the Raiders and the Steelers played each other in the playoffs 5 consecutive years from 72 to 76. That is still an NFL record. It has never happened. Okay. And the last 3 were AFC title games. And the last 3, the team that won the AFC title game won the Super Bowl. So that to me. Second, in 1975, and I'm getting a little specific here. They played in a division in the AFC Central with the Cincinnati Bengals, the Houston Oilers, and the Cleveland Browns. The Steelers were 12-2. The Bengals were 11-3. They lost to the Steelers twice and the Browns. The Oilers were 10-4, did not make the playoffs because you didn't have the playoff teams back then. The only teams that the Oilers lost to were twice to the Bengals and twice to the Steelers. So they came out of that division battle-tested. And I think that was a big part of their success. And Terry Bradshaw was always, he's got almost as many interceptions as he does touchdown passes, but he was a guy who called his own plays. You think about Super Bowl 13 when they beat the Cowboys in the first rematch in Super Bowl history. And we talk about Franco Harris and their running game and all that stuff. That was the first time in Super Bowl history that a team had 2 100-yard receivers. The Steelers, with their running game, they had 2 100-yard receivers. It was Bradshaw's first 300-yard passing game. So, again, the test of time of what they were able to do after a makeover, for lack of a better reason. Okay? And I'll leave you with this. The Steelers' defense was not the Steelers' defense in the late 70s. Those guys were getting old, understandably. So you saw a lot more blitzing from the Steelers. Okay, Lambert, Ham, defensive backs and so on. They didn't have to do that in the early 70s because Green and Greenwood and Ernie Holmes and Dwight White, were just so dominant. So, again, we're going to talk about the other teams. That's just something to keep in mind. The fact that they were able to win it one way and then reshape themselves and then win it another way.
Well, let's move to a time of neon colors and some crazy looking bras, the 1980s. Go ahead, Rollo.
Don't forget the hair. Don't forget the hair and Aquanet. So the 80s Niners, this is probably the longest running dynasty of all the teams we're talking about. This stretches into 2 decades.
Yes.
But we're going to focus on the 80s. Previous to Bill Walsh arriving in 79, they had only made the playoffs in 4 seasons in the first 28 seasons of their existence. In comes Joe Montana in 1980, and that's when they really took off. Names like Joe Montana, Ronnie Lott, Fred Dean, Jerry Rice, Charles Haley, Roger Craig, Dwight Clark. I mean, these are just some of the names. They had 8 seasons of 10-plus wins, including a 15-1 season in 1984, and with the Super Bowl win, and a 14-2 campaign in '89 with the chip. They were top 10 in offensive yards and points in 9 of the 7 seasons in the 80s. They were also top 10 in defense and points allowed in 8 of those seasons. They won 104 games. 69% of their games were wins, and they won 4 Super Bowl titles and went 4-0 in all those Super Bowls. They won 7 division titles and only missed the playoffs in 1980, which is Joe Montana's first season, and the strike-shortened season of '82. Even in one of the seasons they did make the playoffs, they had one of the biggest comebacks in NFL history when they were down 35-7 to New Orleans and wound up coming back and winning 38-35. Some of the moments of that 80s dynasty were the catch, which is behind me. They were the first team to win 15 games in an NFL season and also 18 wins in a season. They had the first player with 1,000 yards and 1,000 yards rushing in Roger Craig. And this is a team that going into the 90s, they won 109 games and added another Super Bowl. So this is the longest running dynasty of all the teams we're talking about today. This is why they are the greatest dynasty of all time.
Russell, I feel too that this team was the best team at replacing players that would leave. Montana's gone, Young is in. Roger Craig's gone, Ricky Waters is in. You know, you had Taylor, you had Rice, eventually Owens. They have just always been able to replace whoever was old and done.
That's a great point, and it leads me to something I remember reading a long time ago. When Bill Walsh was running the 49ers, he obviously pretty good at looking what's going on around the league and so on. And I'm not quoting him because I don't have the quote in front of me. But what it was about was the fact that he was not going to let the 49ers age like the Steelers did. I think he felt that the Steelers held on to some of their players far too long. Okay. And that wound up costing the Steelers. And in 1980, the Steelers, a lot of injuries, age crept up with them. They were 9-7, then missed the playoffs. Then they missed the playoffs in 81 too. So that was something he was not going to let happen. You'll remember in 1990, we had free agency called Plan B. You remember that? Plan B? Okay. Mm-hmm. And I think Ronnie Lott was a part of that. And I think Roger Craig might have been a part of that. So they were willing to part ways with people, unlike what the Steelers did. And again, that was pre-free agency. Free agency, as we know it now, it started in 1993. What was interesting about the 80s 49ers, and I love what Rollo said about, extending this into the 1990s as they did, as they changed parts and obviously changed head coaches. George Seifert was the head coach in 1989 when they won their 4th Super Bowl. They had the strike season in 82. They had a losing season after winning the Super Bowl. It was funny because early on they struggled to defend their title. In 85, I think they were 1 and done against the Giants. But the other thing that's keep in mind, and again, right off the top of my head, there were only 5 49ers that were a member of those 4 Super Bowl title teams, opposed to the Steelers and the Packers, who had much more people involved in their dynastic runs of 7 years and 8 years and so on. So that was the plan when it came to Bill Walsh and so on. And of course, I don't have to remind anybody, there was maybe a little tension between Joe Montana and Steve Young in the late 80s when obviously Bill Walsh was getting ready to transition. And what Steve Young was able to do, and I worked with Steve, to be honest with you, and so on, and he was just a far different quarterback than Joe Montana. Okay? Now, I don't know if I'll put them, if you include the 90s, it's a different story. In terms of the 80s, I think they're a little notch below the Steelers because of the way they didn't necessarily follow up and so on. But I will also say this. To this day, I think the 1989 49ers are the greatest football team I've ever seen, at least during the Super Bowl era. Okay, they were 14-2. They lost a narrow home game to the Rams, who they beat later. They lost a kind of a nail biter to the Packers and the Magic Man, Don Majkowski, there. And then they went into the playoffs and outscored the Vikings, Rams, and Broncos by 100 points, 126-26. And Montana, Rice, Craig, Taylor, etc. Few people talk about how good that defense was. That defense was probably the unsung hero of that team. And of course, Seifert was a defensive guy, and that, he took over for Walsh. Remember, at one stage during the 1988 season, and they won their Super Bowl there, they were 6-5 and couldn't get out of their own way. There was a lot, and then they caught fire at the end of the year. And obviously they also struggled in the Super Bowl. But again, their defense came up big against the Bengals. The Bengals offense, which was very explosive with Boomer Esiason and all their weapons, the Bengals offense never scored a touchdown in that game. Remember, Stanford Jennings had a kickoff return, and they had 3 field goals. Okay, and then Montana, obviously, with the clutch drive and John Candy in the stands, and Roger Craig, who I think should be in the Hall of Fame because of his just amazing versatility. You talked about the 1,000 season in '85. So I put them a notch below the Steelers, but on the other hand, the '89 49ers, I still haven't seen a team that's as balanced offensively and defensively as they were, and they were just an absolute playoff terror.
Well, we're going to move to our final dynasty tonight, and it's a time of grunge and a time of Saved by the Bell, the 1990s, the Dallas Cowboys. So 160 wins in the 90s, and that is the most in a decade by any team tonight, by a large margin of 16 wins. Now, I do know that the Pack played a few less games, but even if you give them a whole nother season, they still don't catch them. So they won 3 Super Bowls in that decade, defeating the Bills twice and the Steelers. I'm sure that hurt Matt there, but this team started to come together in 1989. Jerry Jones becomes the owner. He hires Jimmy Johnson as the head coach. If they could have got along, I wonder how many more they might have won. Unfortunately, they did butt heads a lot, but Jimmy was smart enough to draft Troy Aikman. Michael Irvin was drafted the year prior. They traded Pro Bowler running back Herschel Walker, which at the time everyone was saying they were crazy for doing that. And they got an obscene amount of draft picks in that trade, which landed them Emmitt Smith, Russell Maryland, Darren Woodson, just to name a few guys there. Their final Super Bowl, they had a new head coach. Barry Switzer comes in. I think it could be debated how good he actually was in the NFL as a coach. I know he was great at Oklahoma and all that, but he leaves a little to the liking for me. And I know some of the players were not real thrilled with him as well either, but I'm actually killing my argument here. Sorry about that. But when Switzer came in, I'm the wild card tonight anyways, but when Switzer came in, they also brought in primetime Deion Sanders at corner there. So if we include Jerry Jones and Jimmy Johnson, this dynasty boasts 8 Hall of Famers. I do believe one day that Darren Woodson will get put in, so that would give them 9. Well, why he hasn't yet is kind of surprising to me. But this team's O-line is what they're known for. The Great Wall of Dallas was absolutely dominant, tough, physical, opened holes, gave up very few sacks. Without them, Emmitt Smith is not the NFL's all-time leading rusher. This line was absolutely incredible. They dominated defensive lines and just opened holes like crazy. And what I will say for this 90s Dallas Cowboys team is the biggest rivalry in the NFL in the early to mid 90s was San Francisco-Dallas. That was the Super Bowl, not what became the Super Bowl. So they had to go through San Francisco every year. And for me, that's right up there with the Steelers having to go through the Raiders. That was the Super Bowl every year, 49ers, Cowboys. So they had a tough game just to get there. And they never, once they got there, they never had the letdown, which they always could have had, and they didn't. So I always find that impressive. Russell, your thoughts on this team? As I mentioned, the O-line, probably the greatest O-line of all time, in my opinion, at least.
Well, certainly in the conversation, some Oakland Raider offensive lines, Shell and Upshaw and Otto and all that. But I think you hit the nail on the head. That's what they were known for. That was their calling card, was that offensive front. And they were able to replace several pieces who went on moving on, like Larry Allen coming in as a rookie getting thrown all over the place by Reggie White, and eventually just a dominant Hall of Fame player. Oh, there you go. And I lost you for some reason. This team, because of what happened with Jimmy Johnson, this is kind of the what if team, okay? Because they won their Super Bowls back to back, and then suddenly he's gone. It's different with Bill Walsh and George Seifert. Bill Walsh stepped away after 10 seasons and so on. Jimmy was just gone, okay? But, I mean, the will of the Cowboys and the talent, and, I've always said, Aikman, Smith, Michael Irvin, to me, was always kind of the leader of that team. And that's not to take anything away from Troy Aikman, because obviously the quarterbacks a lot of times is assumed to be the leader. But they also had a very fast defense, more of a speed defense, a team that came up with takeaways and so on. So I always look at that fact that Jimmy wasn't there, and goodness knows what they would have done. Because I will say this about Jimmy Johnson. I had an opportunity to work an NFL draft with him. He was on with us with ESPN one year. And I'm sure you guys know this. The draft chart, the chart where you make a trade and you figure out what that trade is worth. That's Jimmy Johnson's idea and his staff. Because when he got to Dallas and they wanted to do some things, he was like, I don't know how this works. So let's figure out how drafting has happened over the years. And they did a historic study, and they came up with this chart, which now everybody uses and so on. To me, Jimmy, this is not to take away anything from his coaching. I think in some ways he was a better evaluator of talent than even an on the field head coach. And that's saying a lot, okay? Because you go back and look at Larry Brown, a 12th round draft choice, okay? Leon Lett from Emporia State. These guys were all pivotal parts of their team and so on. So you just think about what also they were before they took over. I mean, Tom Landry was obviously in his latter years, and they went 3-13, and Jerry Jones bought the team, and they fired him and so on. Obviously Michael was part of the 88 team, or Aikman in 89, Emmett in 90 via the trade and so on. They were a team that, and you nailed the thing about the San Francisco 49ers as well. That was for 92, 93, 94, the winner of the NFC title game between those two. And then, of course, the Cowboys in 95 beat the Packers in the NFC championship game, and won their third Super Bowl in 4 years. So I don't do the asterisk thing. Okay. I just wonder what we would have seen if Jimmy Johnson would have been able to stick around. Okay. I mean, Chuck Noll was there the whole time. Bill Walsh was there for the first 10 years, starting in 79. And then, of course, it was Seifert. Okay. Lombardi was there the whole time. Jimmy Johnson built the team, won 2 Super Bowls, and was out of there. So, but they were also a competitive team after the Super Bowls. Okay. They made the playoffs in 96, 98, 99, different head coaches. As we know, Jerry Jones went through head coaches like I go through a bag of potato chips. Okay. So, keep in mind that Jason Garrett is Jerry Jones' longest tenured head coach. Most of those guys were there like 4 years or 5 years, very, very short stints. Jerry got paid. They have a new coach again this year, Brian Schottenheimer. So they were a fun team to watch. When they upset the 49ers, who were big favorites in the 92 game at San Francisco, and then blew out the Bills, 9 takeaways in the Super Bowl. Probably would have set the scoring record in the Super Bowl if someone had not let the ball fall out of his hands, although it was a great hustle play. So a very enjoyable team. And one other thing to compare this to is, remember, free agency started in 93. The free agency system as we know it now, the CBA and so on, that's not something that the 80s Niners and the 70s Steelers and the 60s Packers had to deal with. And if I remember right, in 93, the Cowboys lost some people. And I don't think the only person I can think of who they signed off the top of my head, I think, was Bernie Kosar, like to be a backup. And he wound up having to come in the NFC title game when Troy got dinged and so on. So Jerry Jones was very content. I'm sorry, Jimmy Johnson was very content with the team. And I remember 93, Emmett held out the first 2 games. They were 0-2, still won the Super Bowl. So great team, great championship caliber quarterback. Troy Aikman was usually very, very money and accurate in the playoffs. Emmitt Smith, great playoff performer as well. Their 3 stars came up really, really big in the postseason during that run.
One of those free agents they lost in 93 was Pro Bowler linebacker Ken Norton Jr. went to the 49ers. So, big player there. But let's move into our vote, guys. Cannot pick your own. Brian, who you taking?
Okay, well, I mean, I appreciate all these cases and everything, and I mean, each one of these dynasties sort of has its own characteristics, and to me, the '90s is that. I mean, the '90s Cowboys is that what if? I mean, who knows? I think as powerful as they were, they could have been the top dynasty if Johnson doesn't leave. The Niners, I mean, I love what they established and everything. And if a segue, if somebody wants to look up Bill Walsh's story and how he dealt with the Bengals and how he got revenge on the Bengals. So that's an amazing story. But I mean, I might be showing a little bit of my bias, but I got to go with the Steelers on this one. I mean, just all the Hall of Famers, all the big moments and the dominating defense. To me, that's the best dynasty of this group, in my opinion.
Mac?
It's funny because I actually made a video about this not too long ago, and with me, I always kind of go back and forth on this one. Like one day I say it's us, and the next day I say it's the Niners, and so on. But like as Brian pointed out, like every dynasty had like their own sort of thing. Like out of all these, the Packers, they had the most championships of these. They had 5. Then you have the Steelers. They are still to this day the only franchise in the NFL that has repeated as champions twice, and that's where all their rings came from in the 70s. Niners, they won 4 in the 80s, but they had longevity, and they carried that over into the 90s where they won it in 94. And then obviously got the Cowboys doing it in the shortest amount of time with 3 and 4 years. So I find it very difficult to pick because, like I said, I keep going back and forth on this one. So for the sake of it right now, I would say I am going to give it to the 49ers by like a slight hair. But like, if you catch me on like a good day or something, I'd say us or something, but for right now, I'd say San Francisco by a hair just because of their longevity and being able to find replacements, as Rallo pointed out. So San Francisco by a hair.
Rollo.
Don't forget to check out the archives when Dave Campbell was our guest and talked about some of those 90s championship teams. But the best team of those 70 Steelers didn't win a Super Bowl. That 76 team where they had all those shutouts and, they had Mike Krusek was the quarterback. I mean, they could have very easily won 5 and 6 or 7 years. So I would have to go with the Steelers.
Okay, and thank you for the plug there, Rollo. I'll throw another plug. Check out Dick Cap from the Lombardi Packers in the archives if you want to learn a little more about those teams. But for me, man, I mean, all 4 of these are great. And honestly, like coming in tonight, being a Steelers fan, I would have picked the Steelers, but the Niners argument was really good. But I am actually going with Brian's Green Bay Packers. I know that it was a different time and it was a different game, but there's something to me about winning the very first Super Bowl because people didn't know what it was going to be like when we were combining those two leagues together, the two champions, and putting them in. It's almost like two title games that they had to win to me. So I'm taking the Packers. So that is one for the Packers. Russell, we come to you. Who are you taking?
Well, I think I probably tipped my hand or 11. I'm going to go with the Steelers slightly over the 49ers. I would put Green Bay third, and I would put Dallas fourth in terms of these dynasties and so on. I just think the adaptability of the Steelers and eight run. And Rollo talked about the 76 Steelers, who got off to a 1-4 start that year. Bradshaw got hurt, got slammed by Turkey Jones in the Cleveland game. And that final 9 games in which they won all of them, it's still astounding. I don't care what the rules were. They pitched 5 shutouts. They gave up 28 points total in 9 games. They held 8 of those opponents without a touchdown. The only team that scored a touchdown on them were the Houston Oilers. They scored 2 touchdowns at Pittsburgh in a lopsided loss. They then went into Baltimore. And it's a game probably more well known for a small commuter plane crashing into the top of Memorial Stadium. And thank God the game was a blowout. The Steelers beat the Colts, who were 11-3 and AFC East champions, 40-14. Okay, that was a really good Colts team. And the Steelers, I think, outgained them by about 350 yards.
I think the Colts were the number 1 offense that year too.
Yes, it was.
And Burt Jones was the
Bradshaw to
NFL
Frank
MVP.
Lewis in the first quarter. Now Blyer and Harris got hurt in that game. They didn't play the following week. A lot of Steeler fans get upset about that. Sorry. The Steelers had 2 cracks at the Raiders in 76 and lost both of them. Okay, so it is what it is. But again, I go Steelers 1, slightly over the 49ers, then the Packers, and then the what if I'm going to call them the what if Cowboys.
So a win for Mac and the Steelers tonight. Let's move into our Q&A. It's going to be one question each tonight, guys.
Russell, you've covered a lot of football over the last 40 years. What was the funnest storyline you've ever covered in your time covering sports?
I'll tell you the best time I ever had at a Super Bowl. Maybe that will do it. We were in San Diego for the Packers and the Broncos, which was a dynamic game. You will remember the NFC had won the Super Bowl 13 years in a row. The Broncos probably should have been in the Super Bowl in 96 and stubbed their toes against the Jaguars. The Broncos were a wild card in 97. They were led by a young running back named Terrell Davis. And I happened to work at the time. I worked with Sterling Sharp. So his brother was going to be playing in that Super Bowl. And I remember being at the stadium and being in the stands because that's what they called the auxiliary press box. I was able to go to the first half of the game, and then we'd have to go back to that complex and do NFL primetime. I know it was the first. It was the first time there was ever a Super Bowl, Super Bowl 32, which both teams scored a touchdown on their opening possession. And eventually, the Broncos' persistency with the running game wore the Packers out. And I just remember a lot of mile high salutes. I remember during our pregame show, which I think we were NFL Game Day at the time, or NFL, can't remember what it was at the time. But Sterling interviewed his brother Shannon, and Shannon told Sterling, and Sterling didn't know it was coming. If we win the Super Bowl, I'm giving you my ring. And obviously they pulled off the upset. They were big underdogs and so on. And that, to me, that week out in San Diego was a lot of emotion. John Elway in his latter years back after 3 Super Bowl disasters, and he never really played well in the Super Bowl and so on. There was just a lot going on with that game. So as far as an event, Rollo, I thought that's probably the most fun. I always enjoy doing the NFL draft. I did 20 of them with ESPN, which was 3 or 4 days in New York at the time, and that was always big. You learned a lot sitting in a room with some great football minds and so on. But I would say Super Bowl 32 was the most fun I had covering something.
Go ahead, Brian.
Russell, one of the biggest controversies that devout football fans will be discussing potentially for years to come is whether or not longtime Giants quarterback Eli Manning deserves to be enshrined in the Pro Football Hall of Fame. So I just wonder where you stand on this one.
Well, a lot of people point to the fact that, well, he beat Tom Brady twice in the Super Bowl. Well, to me, that's not good enough. To me, the thing that was great about Eli was his resiliency. Okay. And some people will say, he just racked it. For a long time, the only person that sacked Eli Manning and knocked him out of the game was Ben McAdoo. Correct me if I'm wrong. Benched him. And it cost him and the general manager the job. Eli was back a week later. So the Super Bowl, they had, it's funny. They had 2 Super Bowl runs. One, both of them were 4-game runs. Okay. And both resulted in championships. And the other years, the Giants and Eli didn't win a playoff game. They were all 1 and out or didn't make the playoffs at all. So there was a lot of support there with their defense and so on, but he obviously made his share of big plays. He seemed very calm, cool, and collected when he played in the postseason. I think eventually he'll get in. They changed the rules and tweaked the rules a little. The Hall of Fame's been doing that a lot lately. And I know there's a lot of, well, Jim Plunkett won 2 Super Bowls. Okay, so why isn't he in? Well, you got to look at Jim Plunkett's entire career. The Hall of Fame is a career achievement award, and it's not a team award. Okay, and by the way, I love it. Always love to preface this out for conspiracy theorists. The NFL does not run the Pro Football Hall of Fame. It's a completely separate entity. Okay, so for years and years, I heard, well, the NFL hates the Raiders. That's why they didn't put Ken Stabler and Ray Guy in. Well, it doesn't work that way. It's not, the league isn't calling the shots here and so on. I think eventually Eli will come in because of the impact he had. Obviously, defeating a team that was 18-0 certainly plays a hand in it. Okay. But this should tell you something about where the Hall of Fame is now in terms of changing the rules. I thought the biggest omission this year was Adam Vinatieri. He's the all-time leading scorer in the history of the league. He's the all-time leading postseason scorer in the history of the league. He is delivered in the clutch. Okay. And it's more than about numbers. Okay. We don't have a lot of kickers in the Hall of Fame. We have Jan Stenerud and Morton Anderson. Okay. So I thought he was a bigger omission than Eli was. But I think eventually both of them will get in. Now, I'm curious to see how they're going to keep on tweaking the rules because there are a lot of players who played in the 30s and 40s and 50s and 60s and 70s who really deserve to be in. You got to do a top 100. I usually do a top 30 every couple of years and so on. But I get it. I understand that. A lot of people were assuming that Eli was going to get in because of his last name. How many times did you hear that? Well, Archie Manning's not in the Hall of Fame, and Ricky Manning Jr. isn't in the Hall of Fame either. So much what's in the name.
Good, Mac.
So, Russ, this is actually something that I ask a lot of my subscribers on my channel because I kind of have a mixed bag on my channel. So after the Steel Curtain was kind of done with, and as we all know, 1983 draft, Dan Marino's on the board, Pittsburgh native, and the Steelers had every opportunity to take him. Given how the Steelers were in the 80s with life after the Steel Curtain and how dominant Dan Marino was the first 4 or 5 years of his career, how do you think Dan Marino would have done in Pittsburgh if the Steelers took him?
Well, that's a great question. And obviously the gentleman you're talking about who they did draft was a young man named Gabe Rivera, who wound up, having his career cut short, sadly. That's a tricky one because you could use the argument that And again, it's a team sport, but Dan Marino played in one Super Bowl in the second season and never got back there again. Okay. And that had a lot to do with the philosophy of the Dolphins. Remember, I give Don Shula a lot of credit. He found somebody who was totally unlike Bob Greasy or Earl Morrall. And even though we've seen bigger numbers since then, Patrick Mahomes 2022 complete season, Dan Marino's 1984 season was like a video game. And you weren't prepared for that because you just didn't see anything. Like when he came in there, they beat the Washington Redskins, who had been in 2 straight Super Bowls, went into RFK Stadium and beat them 35-17. It wasn't even that close. Okay, that 84. Now, but here's the problem. And this is where I'd be curious to see what Chuck Noll would have actually done with Dan Marino. By the end of 84, and we know they lost to the 49ers badly in Super Bowl 19, their defense was completely worn out, okay, because they were scoring so fast. Oh, we got to go out there again? Are you kidding me? That's why the Chargers of the early 80s had such prolific offenses and couldn't get to the Super Bowl. Because, you know, the 79 Chargers, the year the Steelers won their 4th Super Bowls, whacked the Steelers 35-7 in San Diego. I thought they were the best team in the league. And then they got upset by the Houston Oilers in the playoffs. And year by year, you had Don Coryell electrifying points, passing yards, blah, blah, blah. But they were in shootouts and they couldn't survive all those shootouts and so on. So there's a lot to be said for balance in this league, even though we've changed the rules. So I'd be curious of how Dan Marino and how Chuck Noll would have coexisted in terms of the style, because Jimmy Johnson tried to get the Dolphins to become a more balanced team. And the years he was there, they ran the ball early in the season. And by mid-season and late season, they're throwing the ball all over the place. Okay. And Jimmy he got the team to the playoffs a couple of years. Don't get me wrong. But you find that all these electrifying passing numbers don't necessarily add up to titles. I've thrown this stat out many times. And my old friend Sean Salisbury, one day I was doing a podcast with him. He goes, "Oh my God, I didn't know that." And this was before Patrick Mahomes became the only quarterback to do it. There have been 59 years of the Super Bowl. Patrick Mahomes in 2022 is the only quarterback to lead the league, and including the AFL and NFL combined, in passing yards and win the Super Bowl the same year. Think about that. We've seen guys lead the league in passing yards and have losing records. It depends on when those passing yards are coming. Okay, so as modernized as the game is and all these electrifying numbers and so on, there's a lot to be said for beating the hell out of the other opponent. And just ask how Patrick Mahomes and the Chiefs felt after dealing with that defensive line and offensive line of the Philadelphia Eagles. We saw it in the Super Bowl, Patriots and Giants. Okay, 18-0. They set records. Randy Moss, most touchdown receptions in the season. Brady, 50 touchdown passes. Season low, 14 points against the Giants in the Super Bowl. There are so many instances of that in NFL history. The Raiders beating the Redskins in Super Bowl 18. They were the highest scoring team in the league history. Got 9 points in the Super Bowl. Peyton Manning and the Seahawks and the Broncos. Still the NFL record for points. They got 8 in the Super Bowl. Okay, how many examples do you need that this is not a one-man game? You want to watch a one-man game, play tennis or racquetball. Okay, but those big numbers. So that's another great what if, and I think it's probably the most popular what if in NFL history. I know it's kind of a bold statement, but you hear that a lot, especially right now when the Steelers haven't really decided on when Aaron Rodgers is going to join the team. Okay, which I think he is, and then next year they'll probably go after a quarterback with those 12 draft choices they're predicted to get, compensatories and trades and all that stuff. So that's a great question. The local product, et cetera, et cetera. And I certainly hope that didn't play into their decision to get Kenny Pickett a couple of years ago, because, they were about 39 years too late. So,
yeah. Marino would have got his if it wasn't for Ray Finkel. But anywho, we'll get you out of here with this. I understand that you worked for CBS Thursday Night Football for a little bit there.
I
That was
did one
something,
season. Yeah, I'm
yeah.
sorry. Go ahead.
No, it was just something new at the time for the NFL playing Thursday night games. And
Hmm.
so, what was that experience like for you and the crew? And I know that often at the beginning, it was not very good football.
Well, they went to the Thursday night format for like a weekly thing. And, we had Thursday night games periodically, a Friday night game, the Thanksgiving games, et cetera, et cetera. Um, what was unique about it for me was I did studio shows at ESPN the whole time I was there, except for we'd go on the road to do the Super Bowl and I would do the NFL draft. But my basic responsibilities as, the researcher were for Sunday Countdown, Monday Countdown, and of course, still the greatest show that ever lived on ESPN, NFL Primetime. And I was able to sit in the studio for never missed a show. I think I did 17 years without missing a show, working with Chris Berman and Tom Jackson. So when I was approached by CBS Thursday Night Football, it was different because I was on the road every week. And so, I'm in Kansas City, I'm in San Francisco, I'm in Houston. That was totally different than what I had done with ESPN. And I worked with James Brown, I worked with Bill Cowher, and I worked with Deion Sanders. And there was a crossover with the NFL Network. I got to know Nate Burleson kind of well, Amber Theo Harris, some of the other hosts. There's some of them not there anymore, and so on. So there was a crossover between NFL Network and CBS. I got semi-reunited with Phil Simms, who did the games with Jim Nantz. I worked with Phil 1 year at ESPN before he left for NBC and then eventually worked out. So being on the road was just a different atmosphere as well. And it was also CBS was a different company. It wasn't a cable network, it was a major network. So that led to different opportunities. And again, people very excited about seeing Deion and Bill Cowher at the games and so on. And again, Nate Burleson has really come onto his own in a lot of different aspects on CBS and so on. So I thoroughly enjoyed the change of pace. They actually brought me back for the Super Bowl, which was, I think, the last Super Bowl I actually got to attend, Super Bowl 50 out in San Francisco. So it was a great experience because it was something I had never done. And, you were constantly running into old colleagues at ESPN, Steve Young, and because they were there doing their thing for ESPN for a Thursday night game. And probably the best game I saw was the Aaron Rodgers to Richard Rodgers Hail Mary at Detroit, when that game looked like it was over. And, we're all sitting in the truck and all of a sudden, bang, bang, all those graphics that we had ready for the end. Might have to do a little changes and so on. So that was a great experience doing the road for CBS, which it's hard to believe it's now 10 years ago. And now it's Amazon Prime Video, and it's, the NFL's done a great job at giving them better games, to be honest with you. They have a lot more. The NFL and TV is such a different beast than when I was a kid. Now it's, I can remember watching games. I'm dating myself, which I did often during high school. You're watching a game on, and Rollo, you might relate to this. You're watching a game on NBC, and it's almost like they don't mention the CBS games. Okay. Now everybody's one big happy family. There's a lot of interpromotional stuff and so on. You're like, well, what's the score of, maybe you would get it maybe at halftime. Okay. But pre-promotion, now everybody promotes the whole slate for week 1 or week 2. Back then it was like a secret. There was no NFL primetime. So you watch Monday Night Football. So Howard Cosell would do the halftime highlights and pick out like his best games and so on. You didn't have the highlights from every game. And so, you couldn't watch a game on your phone. You couldn't watch a game on your laptop. You couldn't watch a game. So much different. It's such a different beast now. And in a lot of ways, it's obviously very advantageous because The appetite for football in this country is, I don't want to say it's mind-boggling, but it is astounding. I tell people all the time, I'll leave you with this. During the off season, I have more people read what I write than during the regular season, because people during the regular season, the playoffs, are watching the games. They could care less what I have to write. They get to see it. But boy, you mention some sort of rumor, you hear this, you hear that, you make a prediction, they're all over you. And God bless them for being like that.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Russell, and sharing with us today.
This was a blast. Let me just tell you. Let me know when I can come back in 20 minutes if you want. So
All right.
this is right in my wheelhouse. And I love the fact that you guys do history and the modern game at the same time. So
a reminder, everybody, hit that like, subscribe, notification button. We'll see everybody next time. Have a great night.